For centuries, the Forbidden City stood as the majestic heart of Imperial China, a fortress of golden rooftops and ceremonial grandeur. But beyond its splendor lay a world unseen, thousands of concubines, chosen not for their voice, but for their beauty, caught in lives of obedience and silence. Not wives, not servants, but something more ambiguous, used, confined, and forgotten. Their names were often lost to time, their stories reduced to whispers behind painted screens. Yet within that silence, entire worlds of longing, intelligence, fear, and strategy unfolded. In the summer of 1424, mourning fell over the palace. The Yongle emperor, celebrated for his military prowess and architectural ambition, had died. But death in the imperial court came with tradition, cruel and precise. 30 favored concubines received squares of crimson silk. Not tokens of grief, but silent commands to follow him into the afterlife. Their devotion demanded erasure. There was no protest, only quiet preparation, a ritual of fading, as if the palace itself swallowed their final breath. The ritual was framed as loyalty, an ultimate act of fealty that transcended the world of the living. But beneath the rhetoric was power, the emperor's authority stretching past death, binding the living to his memory. These women, who had learned to speak softly and move perfectly, became footnotes in an empire that glorified permanence and erased the vulnerable. No funerary rites of their own choosing. No laments beyond the palace walls. The note beyond the palace wall. Only the unspoken understanding that, even in the end, they would be folded neatly into someone else's story. Their world was one of contradiction. Within gilded rooms scented with rare incense and embroidered with gold, they were schooled in music, dance, calligraphy, and poetry, and poetry, and poetry. Their lives mirrored elegance, yet were tightly bound by invisible chains. They dined on imperial delicacies and wore robes of woven brocade, all while navigating a court ruled by paranoia and shifting affections. The emperor's attention could elevate, but neglect reduced them to shadows. The most exquisite compliments could vanish overnight, leaving only silence in their wake. Surveillance was constant. Servants, eunuchs, maids, all saw, and many reported. Rumors moved faster than footsteps, clinging to walls like smoke. Even silence could be dangerous. A wrong glance, a misplaced word, a small misstep in etiquette could brand a woman arrogant or foolish. In corridors where every smile could conceal a blade, trust was a luxury. Friendship, a liability. Friendship, a liability. The inner palace trained its women to hold themselves like porcelain, polished and unbreakable, while knowing that a single crack could shatter their world. The Ming dynasty, born from rebellion and built by the hands of a former peasant, the Hongwu emperor reforged the court with strict order. In his vision, governance extended into every chamber and ritual, every garment and greeting. Concubinage, long established, was reinforced with structure. Girls from every corner of the empire could be summoned, their families submitting with trembling hope. Hope. The imperial call was not a question, one answered freely. It was a tide that swept households away. Carrying daughters behind red walls, they would never leave. For some families, the summons seemed like destiny. A chance for honor, a thread tying a lineage to the heart of power. For others, it was a quiet devastation concealed by formal smiles. Mothers pressed hairpins into their daughters' hands. Fathers stood with eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to follow. A girl might leave home at 13 and never again see the street where she once played. Letters were rare and censored, visits rarer still. The palace gates closed behind her with a soft finality. Entry began with scrutiny. Physicians inspected health. Attendants measured posture, gait, tone of voice. The court prized symmetry, calm, and a polished serenity that suggested inner order. A girl who fidgeted, who spoke too quickly, who showed her heart too easily, could be sent home in a single gesture. Those who remained were reshaped, taught to kneel correctly, to greet with precise bows, to smile without showing teeth, to glide rather than walk. It was not only training. It was not only training. It was transformation. They memorized forms of address, honorifics, ritual sequences for festivals, the proper position of hands during ceremonies. They learned to read the air of a room, the slight nod, the quickened breath, the angle of a fan that meant a wait or a do not speak. In a place where mistakes were remembered, perfection became a kind of shield. Each day began with inspection and ended with reflection. Even dreams carried the scent of incense and the rhythm of ritual. See, beneath the empress, who stood as the embodiment of virtue and authority, ranked the consorts, women with noble lineage or distinguished favor, who navigated influence with careful restraint. Their titles structured space, privileges, and power, the size of their quarters, the colors they could wear, the foods they were permitted, the servants they commanded. Below them waited an ever-renewing sea of concubines, polished like jewels, and poised on the brink of obscurity. Their rank could rise with a nod from the throne, or vanish overnight. Favor was a double-edged blade. A single night could lift a woman into wealth and recognition. With elevation came new robes, rare ornaments, ceremonial duties, and sometimes a new pavilion, swathed in silk. But power drew eyes like a lantern on a dark road. Jealousy lit fires in quiet rooms. Secrets became currency. Alliances were whispers that could evaporate by morning. The same glance that bestowed privilege might, weeks later, mark the start of a fall. Food was both luxury and liability. Imperial kitchens produced delicacies from across the empire, fresh lychees packed in ice, wild herbs harvested at dawn, fish steamed to perfect tenderness. Yet every dish was tested, every cup of tea watched. Poison was a word no one spoke too loudly, but precautions multiplied in silence. An extra taster, a ritual of rinsing, a sealed jar broken only under witness. Trust was a ceremony performed again and again, never fully believed. Clothing became a language. Colors signaled rank and occasion. Embroidery announced blessings, seasons, and celestial favor. Hairpins carried motifs, phoenix for grace, peonies for prosperity, clouds for longevity, while also communicating station. A misplaced emblem could be read as insolence. Silk rustled like whispers in dim corridors. A woman learned to wear herself like a scroll. Others could read, controlled, composed, correct. The seasons turned inside the palace with their own rhythm. Spring brought floral rites and the careful tending of imperial gardens, where women walked among peonies and magnolias under the watch of attendants. Summer was thick with heat and restlessness. Screens were lifted to catch the rare breeze, and evenings filled with soft music to soothe the emperor's temper. Autumn festivals demanded precision and poetry. Winter gathered silence like snow, discipline tightening as frost settled on painted eaves. In this world, even love became treason. A longing glance exchanged with a eunuch, the only men allowed within the inner precincts, could be enough to end a life. A quiet friendship that grew too close, a promise whispered through a screen, a hand held for a heartbeat too long. Each was a step toward danger. Punishments ranged from demotion to confinement, from exile to the cold palace, a place where women disappeared into long winters of neglect. Stories rarely ended with romance. They ended with survival or surrender. Eunuchs were both guardians and gatekeepers. Castration had severed them from the ordinary rhythms of family, but it had bound them to power's center. They memorized routes and rhythms, kept keys and schedules, delivered messages, and watched faces for clues. Some became patrons, others parasites. A few rose to terrifying influence by mastering the flow of information. To speak to a eunuch was to speak indirectly to the palace itself. To misjudge one could be fatal. Pregnancy could transform a life. A woman who bore a son secured a place not only for herself, but for her family. The child would be raised under rigid protocols and watched by many, especially by the empress, who often took imperial heirs under her formal protection. But the path was haunted by fear. Miscarriages whispered through corridors, complications cloaked by silence, rivalries inflamed by the power that a cradle could bring. Blessings arrived with shadows. Lullabies were sung in careful tones. There were moments of tenderness, unexpected and fragile. Unexpected and fragile. A concubine might keep a small painted fan from her childhood hidden beneath a chest. Another might compose a poem no one would ever read, etching characters on silk with water, so the lines would disappear by morning. Some kept birds and taught them to mimic melodies. Others embroidered scenes of mountains they had never seen again, their stitches a map back to a life remembered in fragments. Their rooms became museums of private memory. Festivals offered glimpses of release. Lanterns glowed like floating stars. The palace filled with music, scented rice, and ritual theatre. Women watched shadow plays where heroes escaped impossible fates and lovers found each other across worlds. For a few hours, the iron geometry of rank softened. An empress might laugh quietly. Quietly. A concubine might forget the weight of her hairpins. But dawn always came, and with it, the ledger of duty returned. Punishment was meticulous. A woman demoted could lose not only rank, but her voice, servants reassigned, visitors curtailed, meals reduced to austerity. The cold palace was not a place of visible cruelty, but of sustained erasure. There, time thickened, days blurred, winter seeped into bones that once danced. If survival was an art, invisibility became its darkest brushstroke. Those who returned from such exile rarely regained the brightness of their earlier days. Amid this system, some found ways to bend the rules without breaking them. They mastered the art of absence, being present when needed and unseen. When danger brewed, they gave gifts not to the emperor, but to the people who kept his world turning. A physician's apprentice, a seamstress with a quiet gift for beauty, a librarian who could find just the right anthology for a night when the emperor wanted poetry. The influence flowed through channels the edicts never mentioned. There were, too, the women who defied gravity altogether. Wu Zetian, who began as a concubine, rose not as an ornament, but as a strategist. She watched, learned and calculated, understanding that power in the palace was less about proximity and more about perception. When the chance came, she reshaped roles rather than merely filling them. Her story was not a simple triumph. It was a testament to how a mind, disciplined and daring, could navigate a labyrinth designed to trap her. Centuries later, another figure would step from the fringe into the center. Cixi, we saw. She entered the court as a low-ranking concubine, known for composure and careful intelligence. She did not chase favor in obvious ways. She listened. She learned names, capacities, character. When she bore a son who would become the Tongjai emperor, the axis shifted. Motherhood within the palace was not only tenderness, it was leverage. Through ritual and law, maternal ties could become political ties. Cixi's power did not arrive in a sudden tide. It gathered like mist, then settled with unmistakable presence. As Empress Dowager, she ruled from behind a silk screen, her voice reaching the court through ceremonies that both concealed and revealed her will. She was not merely a guardian of a boy's throne. She was a conductor of the music around it. Some called her conservative, others cunning. others cunning. Many called her formidable. Like the palace itself, she could be read in many ways, and all were incomplete. Her regency unfolded amid storms, foreign pressures, internal reforms, intrigues woven with threads too fine for outsiders to see. She made compromises. She drew lines. Compromises. She drew lines. She fortified what she believed must endure and allowed what she thought might bend without breaking. The court became a stage for a choreography of survival in an era where the wind outside the walls blew colder each year. When she died, she left behind a legacy both contested and undeniable. Proof that, in a world crafted to contain them, women could steer the ship through treacherous waters. For the countless women whose names did not become legend, life was no less complex. Some grew old within the palace, their faces softening into lines etched by patience. They became tutors to younger women, teaching not only forms and phrases, but the quiet ways one could protect a soul in a place that claimed ownership over bodies. A kind word given at the right moment. A shared remedy for sleeplessness. A story told in metaphor, so its lesson remained invisible to those who might punish it. Art became a refuge. A concubine might paint orchids, the flower of perseverance, on scraps of silk no one would miss. Another might copy verses from ancient poets whose words spoke to being seen and unseen, present and ephemeral. Music was both display and sanctuary. A gukin murmuring notes that changed the shape of a room, even when no one seemed to notice. To create was to assert existence in a place that preferred its women to be perfect and replaceable. There were healers among them, too, women who learned herbal lore and massage from elder attendants, who knew how to ease fevers or coax appetite back with ginger and jujube. Within the formal machinery of palace medicine, small acts of care travelled quietly hand to hand. A warmed cup before an anxious night, a poultice against headaches induced by hair ornaments that weighed too much. Comfort existed in pockets, guarded like treasure. It was not rebellion. Frasier, it was not rebellion. It was resistance. On rare days, the emperor pulled back the veil and spoke to a concubine as if she were simply a person and not a role. They might discuss a poem, the weather beyond the city, a dream in which a river ran backward and a boat did not capsize. Such conversations were dangerous in their own way. They invited a humanity the system had little room for, yet they happened until they didn't. Power returned, and with it, masks. When an emperor died, the palace shifted on its axis. Ranks rearranged, alliances unraveled and reformed. Some women were moved to quieter quarters. Others saw their influence evaporate in days, like dew under a hard sun. The new reign brought new rhythms, new preferences, new dangers. A woman who had flourished under one sovereign could find herself suddenly on the wrong side of taste and memory. Stability was ritual. Security was myth. The outside world barely noticed. Official records seldom lingered on the interior lives of women. At times a name flashed, promoted, demoted, transferred. A birth recorded, a death noted. See, noted. The kind of handwriting that evaluated a woman's grace would never have been entrusted to the public. Histories remembered the emperors and their monuments, their decrees and wars. The palace women lingered as figures in footnotes, their voices muted by distance and design. Yet, if you listen, the echoes remain. In poems attributed to Anonymous, elegant and melancholy. In porcelain cups stained with tea, where a lip once rested. In embroidery where a mountain stream bends around a rock, with a tenderness that feels like confession. In a lacquered box worn smooth where fingers touched it often, lives gather in the details the official world forgets to tidy away. The palace did not only refine women, it was refined by them invisibly. There were rules that made sense to no one, but those inside. A certain screen adjusted at a particular angle meant a visitor was unwelcome without the embarrassment of saying so. A set of flowers arranged in a specific order on the third day of the lunar month signaled caution. The way an attendant placed a tray, slightly to the left, communicated that someone had asked a question you should not answer. The covert language of survival grew lush where overt language was constrained. Sometimes, laughter still burst out where it wasn't supposed to. A performance went wrong, and a dancer tripped. The Empress hid her smile behind a sleeve and let it glow in her eyes. A concubine mispronounced a line of a classical poem, realized it, and dissolved into giggles before regaining composure. The palace prized perfection, but the human heart insisted on peeking through. In those moments, the walls seemed to breathe. Not all eunuchs were schemers. Not all concubines were competitors. A young eunuch, newly arrived, might weep quietly in a courtyard, mourning a life cut in half. An older concubine might pause, adjust the angle of his cap, and tell him which steward to avoid and which to trust. Kindness was a form of intelligence. It created debts without calling them favors. It built bridges that sometimes held when everything else gave way. Time changed even the most rigid institutions. Walls darkened, gardens were replanted, new emperors aged into ritual. The palace adapted in ways that looked like repetition from the outside and like evolution from within. Music shifted, fashion shifted. The taste for certain poems waned and returned. And through these changes, women who had been trained to be silent learned small ways to echo back to the world. A painted fan slipped to a visiting noblewoman. A rumor set right before it caused harm. A tradition softened so it no longer cut so deep. When the end of a life arrived, often quietly, sometimes abruptly, the palace observed its rights. The woman's belongings were inventoried, her servants reassigned, her room refreshed for the next occupant. Yet traces lingered. A faint scent on a pillow, a small scratch on a table where a ring once caught the lacquer. A poem fragment tucked behind a beam that no one found for a century. The palace swallowed and moved on. The world beyond never knew what had been lost. And still, the stories surface. A ledger bearing an unfamiliar name. A family's oral history that mentions a daughter summoned and never seen again, her memory carried in the way her mother folded linens. A line in a poem that scholars argue over because it feels too personal to be purely metaphor. History is not generous to the people it calls marginal, but they persist, like threads woven so finely into silk that you only notice them when the light strikes at the right angle. The Forbidden City is often imagined as a realm of absolute control. In truth, it was a human place, rigid and tender, terrifying and beautiful, cruel and full of small graces. It kept its women in cages lined with brocade and taught them to sing in perfect pitch. But it could not erase their inner lives. In the spaces between ceremonies, they breathed, dreamed, learned, and sometimes, quietly, changed the course of the empire simply by enduring within it. We return, finally, to the image of the crimson silk, a square of color held in a trembling hand. It represents what was demanded and what was endured, but there were other silks in that world. Banners at festivals, sashes tying hair, ribbons unfurling from sleeves during dances that made the emperor forget the weight on his shoulders for one fleeting moment. There was silk stitched by women who saw beyond their own circumstances and left beauty where they were told to leave only silence. For the faceless, the unnamed, the forgotten, we can at least say this: they were not ornaments. They were lives. Their world was lavish, yes, but also lonely, disciplined, but not without warmth. They were taught to walk softly, Yet they left footprints you can still follow if you know how to look. Every ritual they performed was a fragment of a larger story. Every breath they took inside those walls was part of a history that matters. Walls was part of a history that matters. And so, when we imagine the Forbidden City at dusk, the roofs glowing like embers, the courtyards deepening into shadow, we can also imagine a single room lit by a small lamp. Inside sits a woman, a concubine, a scholar of survival. She is writing a poem she will never sign. She is humming a melody she learned as a child. She is remembering the street where she last saw the sky without a frame. She is not a legend, not a queen, not a villain. She is simply human, and that is enough to fill the palace with meaning. In the end, empires are measured not just by their conquests or their palaces, but by the lives lived in their shadows. The Forbidden City rose and endured, its rituals copied, and its power feared. Yet its truest legacy may well be the quiet strength of the women who moved like water through its narrow channels, who learned to bend without breaking, who carried within them a light no screen could fully hide. If we listen closely, we can still hear it. Soft, steady, undeniable. A heartbeat behind silk.